Where will future oil and gas supply come from? It's a pleasure having Professor Cleveland Jones, researcher at ENOG, geoscience and geopolitics consultant. Good afternoon, Professor Cleveland Jones.
Good afternoon, Cavania. So happy to be here with you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure for me. Thank you. Uh, Let me share, please, with you three very short slides. OPEC
Mhm.
predicts 116 million barrels per day in 2045. Of course, there are other institutions that see different numbers.
Yes.
Another card that I would like to show is a country with high demand for oil, the US, China, and including Brazil in 10th position. And the last one is related to big oil producers. Brazil is not yet in this list. I know that you have some critics about that, but
Yeah.
okay, it's not yet here. Professor Cleveland, please, are there enough reserves for all this expected consumption of oil and gas for the future?
Yes, Cavania. The problem is that there are, in fact, there's too much. There's too much oil and gas in really maybe not proven, but known producible, meaning recoverable oil and gas resources. And they will never be entirely produced, and there will be huge amounts of oil and gas that will remain underground, not because of the end of the oil age, but just as the oil age begins to peter out. This could be by 2070, 80, whatever. But whatever is the ultimate date when oil and gas begins to be really much less significant, there will still be many, many billions of barrels of oil and gas that will remain unproduced. Even if we don't make too many new discoveries, just among the regions, the trends, the provinces that we know of nowadays. This is based, and I think we should base this on very reliable information from agencies such as the U.S. Geological Survey, which does a very good job of assessing oil and gas provinces. For example, they did this in 2001 for the world, all over the world. They did it again in 2012. Very good assessments and with exceptionally good methodology, probabilistic. They divided the world into provinces and then into assessment units. They didn't assess absolutely every assessment unit in every province, but they assessed all of the main ones. And their assessment took into consideration geological factors, favorability, oil and gas potential, not geopolitical, technological, environmental. They basically said, where is the oil? Is it producible at near uh, market rates? And this is what our assessment is of what could be recovered from those basins assessment units.
You sent to me some pictures. Would you like
Yeah,
to talk about that? So
yeah.
please
If
let
you
me
can
know
put
when I
that
have.
first one. This
Yeah.
is the assessment that the USGS did in 2012. This is a summary. And they did this, and they have a full explanation of their methodology, the regions where they assess, and some major conclusions. And I think this is what ought to be guiding us when we discuss, what about this basin? What about West Africa? What about Southeast Asia? They have looked at all of this, and they have the resources that certainly can match Exxon and BP and Shell to do this on a worldwide basis, because companies will spend a lot of effort looking at the areas that they control, the concessions they have. But the USGS is doing this from a strategic point of view of the importance of knowing about the recoverable potential of oil and gas in the world, the strategic importance of this for the U.S. in developing international policies and so on, energy policies. This information is very useful for the rest of the world. In fact, their methodology is very similar to the study that we conducted that you know well about the Brazilian pre-salt oil gas potential, which we did in 2011 the first time, which predated this assessment, but it was basically the same, a probabilistic assessment. We take a historical information of discoveries, geological information. We use our expertise as geologists to assess factors that affect success ratios in discoveries. Certainly, some variables have uncertainties associated. We put all of that in, and then we do Monte Carlo simulation to assess this in a probabilistic method, and we come up with the number of accumulations that can be discovered in the future, the size, their size distribution, and then ultimately the total recoverable resources that are out there in the world. This is useful, but as we just said, this is just a geological assessment for the entire world. They don't do an assessment of, what can the Arctic actually do. That's what I did. I looked at this and I said, the USGS did a wonderful job. They studied, these basins and these assessment units, but in places that I am sure, this is my input now, that will not result in any production in the foreseeable future. And any assessment units, any basins, any plays in the world that are fantastic, but do not get put into production in the next 10, 20, 30 years. Forget it. They'll never be put into production. There's a window of opportunity there in the next, say, 20 years. If it can't be developed by then, forget it, because even though the oil and gas age will still be strong, as your estimates, OPEC and others, there's a distribution, the optimistic ones and the more pessimistic ones. But whatever, after 20, 30 years, the appetite for investing in new development in oil and gas won't be there. So if we cannot develop these things in the short term, 10, 20 years, they won't get developed. So there's no use assessing the Arctic, a tremendous number of billions of barrels, because, nothing will happen. Even if the Arctic melts and the ships can go through, there's a number of reasons why a lot of these places just won't fly. I identify some, in particular, Russia, for example, because of sanctions and even in going out in the future, this will last for a while. They do not have the resources, technical, even financial, a lot of limitations. The clamor from the international industry will be strong for them and for Canada, which also, has a lot of Arctic exposure, to not develop this. So this won't go anywhere. And the USGS put that map that we have that maybe shows a little bit that
This
number.
one?
You see, these are the regions that the USGS assessed. All these red regions that are assessment units within them. There's stuff in the Arctic and the tundra in Canada, certainly Brazil, Africa, Southeast Asia.
Sorry, Professor. This parts in red mean what? That
They
are
are
reserves.
no, these are regions where they assess the reserves. So
Okay.
just because they're red doesn't mean that they have high reserves. But this is an area where they assess. These are not actually reserves. These are resources that they think can be technically produced. So in fact, they assess the possibility. For example, in the Arctic, there's a lot of red. They assessed a lot of that.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean much, because they assess that this frontier area has so many plays and the potential is fantastic, but it doesn't mean much. My assessment is beyond the technical geological favorability. It's how likely is it that an assessed unit will eventually be put into production and produced. And some of these areas were assessed, but they won't be put into production. So, it doesn't
Coast
matter what.
coast of Africa, for instance, is a very interesting place. No.
Yes, in fact, as the margins in West Africa and South America are analog margins, and they share a lot of potential. I think when God divided up the continents, he gave a lot more potential to South America than to West Africa, but there's still a lot of potential there. The question is, a lot of those countries are very prone to political risk. It will take 10, 15, 20 years to break into those countries, to find the courage for the major oil companies to really invest and develop those areas. I think it's a race against time, and time does not favor them. Whatever has been really identified now and is well on its way to being developed, yes, that is one reason why I point, for example, to Guyana and even Suriname, and I don't point to the Brazilian equatorial margin up in the northwest, because that will take 10, 15, 20 years. Maybe it's too late. Guyana is on its way, so there's no question there. Certainly the pre-salt, even some areas in the corner of northeast corner of Brazil, some niche areas will be there throughout the world. Some areas in East Africa, some areas in West Africa. Although Nigeria is a very dangerous place to make significant oil bets. You could have a very big country risk, similar to what I pointed out to many companies, BP and others, who invested in Russia. I said, look, those are very risky bets. Russia has tremendous potential, but look at what happened. They lost their shirt.
You mean instability in terms of political instability?
Political risk, operating
risk.
conditions, much more so than environmental restrictions. Nowadays, all of the oil companies know more or less how to handle that, and they can eventually, unless it's really an impossible area, they can present operating regimens where they will be extra careful and so on. So it's not so much the environmental restrictions that will reduce the attractiveness of some of these areas. It's the political instability, and for as long as it takes for the big major companies to come in and invest and develop these areas, if the horizon is over 15, 20 years, that won't happen. They maybe invest a couple billion, but they will give it up, because in 20 years' time, if it's not ready to be produced, it won't fly. That's the big risk.
And offshore projects take a long time to be mature.
They take a long time, and necessarily nowadays, you see all of the major companies have a very careful investment strategy. They have to know the region very well. You can't just get a concession and start drilling. You have to do extensive geophysical work, and you have to do extensive negotiations going forward. And if the company doesn't see geopolitical stability for some regions, it will delay the investment. And finally, if it delays it beyond this window, it just won't fly. So I have argued in many articles that the oil and gas companies, the major ones, will be forced to concentrate their efforts on a few major world-class plays that offer higher security, meaning less country risk. They don't offer unsurmountable environmental restrictions, that have a potential for large accumulations to be developed, and the potential, once those are put into production, to produce at low cost, meaning high productivity wells, so that you get low per barrel cost of lifting, and that can produce for many years, because that provides some stability. That's the resiliency that they will need going forward.
So you do not believe that it's time to start new exploration for new discoveries? It's much more interesting to focus on just discovered big fields and
at least known resources, because all of these companies, and certainly the USGS, know where a lot of these resources are. They may not have been discovered. That's why the assessment by the USGS is called yet to find resources. They know they're there. They just haven't been discovered yet, because you don't know if it's 100 kilometers to the east or the west or whatever. You know it's in the play. And that goes for the pre-salt, that goes for Guyana, that goes for the Gulf of Mexico. So these are regions that we know the resources are there. We just didn't discover them yet. But it's not enough to know that. You have to have regions that are placed within secure boundaries. That's why the Gulf of Mexico is a prime location. It's controlled by the U.S., near to the U.S.
Yeah.
We know the region well, very much infrastructure, easy to develop, and exploration expenditures can result in production within a few years. So that's safe. That is one of the top future oil and gas production regions of the world.
If you could mention 3 or 4 main regions in the world.
That's all there are. 3 or 4, really. Because what happens,
including Brazil, of course.
Yes, I actually put Brazil in second place. I think the pre-salt region, the trend, is second, because, as you know, our assessment is something 170 to 270 billion barrels of recoverable resources. We know they're there. If you expend exploratory efforts, and we already have good infrastructure and knowledge and so on, the discoveries will come. It's a relatively low risk region, Brazil in relation to some African countries.
Stable in terms of contracts, politically. Yeah,
that is paramount.
Certainly
the northwest equatorial margin of Guyana and so on is a prime area as well, because that is already being discovered, and I think the potential is still going to grow for the next 10 years, and then it will be able to continue producing for quite a few years. So right there you have 3 regions, and the rest will be, for example, the Middle East. The Middle East has such huge potential that it will continue to be an oil and gas powerhouse, but I think it will greatly disappoint, because it is a geopolitically unstable area. Very difficult going forward to imagine that all of those resources can really attract, even from their own resources, because those countries are, of course, getting rich on oil, even if they have the money, that they can develop some of these resources. Saudi Arabia, for example, because of such lack of transparency in the oil and gas industry, is hiding the fact that their production is substantially more expensive, for example, than the oil production from the pre-salt. They used to boast that, their production was way under $10, lifting costs under $10 a barrel. I doubt that it's under $10 a barrel nowadays, and it's going up, and it's going up fast, and they exhibit significant, as we have just seen, political risk.
Yeah, you mentioned Middle East, you mentioned Gulf of Mexico, Brazil, offshore Africa coast. What are the bottlenecks of these regions? What are the main constraints that they could have to explore and to produce there?
Yeah, the bottlenecks that people talk about are the trade routes, Malacca, Gulf, Red Sea, all of those things. That is important, I agree. But I think that the real bottlenecks is where the major companies will feel comfortable to invest. And that geopolitical risk obviously takes into consideration, if Iran or someone else can block trade routes, then we're in deep trouble. But that is only a reason for the oil companies to keep from investing where they could turn an interesting play into a producing play. So if you put, for example, that there's a third table here, which I haven't been able, let's see if
I have here, no problem.
Oh yeah, that table. This table is what the USGS produced as their result. And if you look at the bottom, there's 565 billion barrels, the average assessment of yet to find resources beyond what we already know.
Is the potential to find
Yeah,
that.
but these are recoverable resources. They are pretty sure, 50% chance that it's more, 50% chance that is less. But this is a reasonable number for their assessment of the oil that is yet to be discovered. In gas, this 5.6 million BCF, that translates into 1 trillion barrels oil equivalent. So there's a lot of gas. They're very optimistic on gas, which
Interesting.
I agree with. And so this is one reason why it's more or less understandable. While the energy transition will favor gas because it's much more abundant and will be easier and so on, and it's prevalent all over. So this is their numbers. What I've taken from this is the fact that many of those regions you just scratch out. Asia and Southeast Asia, maybe China, you can say they will produce some for them, but this is not significant overall. If you take OPEC on one end for 120 or more million barrels a day, and you take some of the more conservative estimates of 80 million barrels a day by 20, 30, 50, that kind of thing, you say if it's only 100 million barrels, same as it is today, for example. No, there isn't a lot of room for the big guys to grow, and they won't grow. The ones who will grow will be, as I said, Gulf of Mexico will grow, Brazil will grow a lot, Guyana will grow, and there will be the Middle East, but they will maybe stay about the same, maybe decline, maybe even decline significantly. And more importantly, I think Russia, for example, would just fall off the cliff. Russia is a powerhouse today, but their average production per well is around 60 barrels a day. That is totally uneconomical, even if you pay costs in vodka. You can't sustain that. So Russia will fall off a cliff. It won't fall off a cliff today, tomorrow, 5 years, but certainly in 10 years, it is not sustainable. Probably go down to 5-6 million barrels a day. Very big drop. The Middle East, the same. Some countries may increase, even Saudi Arabia might increase, but a lot of other countries will not be able to sustain for all of those reasons I mentioned, geopolitical constraints.
And the United States nowadays, they are, let's see, the biggest producer of gas producer.
Yeah, so, but look, this assessment of the USGS is conventional oil and gas. The U.S. has a big participation in unconventional oil and gas, shale oil and shale gas. This means that this USGS assessment doesn't talk much about unconventionals. And I do this assessment about unconventionals, and I say we are where we're going to be. The United States will continue maybe increasing a little bit. China might, because it is a controlled economy, and its strategic policy might be to increase shale oil and shale gas, which is basically what they can increase. But elsewhere in the world, Vaca Muerta, all of these places, they will struggle to even continue, there is not much future in unconventionals around the world, unfortunately for many countries. There will be big losers. I think when you have expectations of great growth and those will be frustrated, as I expect, that will be a big frustration.
And about Bolivia, the reserves are going down. What's really
It
happening?
needs exploration because even the USGS assessed their resources as significant. They could put those resources into production in less than 10, 15 years. But the problem there is, where will the money come from? And I don't see that changing very soon. Even though Brazil has this policy of helping its neighbors, or this is the old Lula policy, no one is going to help Bolivia produce when we have our hands full in Brazil, when Exxon and Shell have their own projects offshore to develop.
What's better for Brazil to make a strong connection with Bolivia and help them to re-explore, or to go to Argentina now with Milei and make some kind of a partnership with Vaca Muerta?
I think that they will cook them in slow fire. It is not in Brazil's interest to exert any big effort on their behalf. Let them, struggle and survive there on a political front. Of course, we don't want instability in Bolivia or Argentina, but just let them survive, producing here and there. But Vaca Muerta is not going to explode. Bolivia is not going to have a giant revival, but Brazil should and will have to concentrate its efforts offshore, and not with its own resources, because Brazil doesn't have money. Petrobras doesn't have that kind of money. It will be the majors, Shell, Exxon,
Yeah.
those are the guys that can do it. And they are increasingly doing that. Once they've gotten their feet wet, these companies have already internally done much of what I said they should do. I've consulted with some investment banks and companies exactly along these lines, and I think they recognize that they will have to reduce the number of bets they have throughout the world. This idea, 10, 20 years ago, where all the majors have blocks all over Africa, all over Asia, Australia, the North Sea, the US, South America, this is gone. No, it's untenable. They can't do that. It's not in their interest, and it's risky, and they can't administer that. They have to focus on a few big, long-term projects that can be low cost.
And how do you see Brazil being closer to OPEC?
Yeah, for a long time, Brazil has rejected that. I think in the future, that is a very high possibility of that, especially as Brazilian politics changes and OPEC changes, because OPEC will also find itself, especially Middle Eastern OPEC, that it's going to find itself very pressured. Right now, of course, they have great production. Saudi Arabia can affect oil prices. But like I said, going forward, all of these non-OPEC producers will come up and will pressure the Middle East a lot. So these big jumps in production that Iran, Iraq, all these countries are counting on, I think, maybe marginal increases among some of the big ones, but not much. And it's possible, especially Saudi Arabia and Iran and Iraq, that they could surprise us on the downside in 3 or 4 or 5 years. That instead of going up, we could find them, way down. And that, of course, will have to be compensated by growth elsewhere. That is a big takeaway, because it's one thing to know that, the Gulf of Mexico and even onshore United States and Australia will be there, and some niche basins in Africa and elsewhere. But it's going to be difficult to rearrange all of this, especially if world demand stays between 90 and 100, meaning that it won't grow a lot, I believe. Yeah. But even if it stays there, there will be some rearrangement, especially as Russia falls off the cliff. That right there is 5-6 million barrels a day. Saudi Arabia, maybe a few more down. Could be a lot.
Yeah. Before we go to the tricky and challenging question, the last one I have for you, let's try to make some conclusions about what we talked today. First, there is enough reserves for long time. So it's not necessary to start, new regions to explore, but focus on the region that we just found. Brazil is in a very good position, but needs to solve some bottlenecks that we still have. Russia has a very
big challenges.
That's good. Okay. Any other?
But Kavai, there's a big difference, because people say, and exploration. No, you said is true. We have to ignore some regions because they will never fly. But exploration has to continue, and maybe we have to invest a lot more in exploration in the regions that I identified, that I said, those 3 or 4 regions need a lot of investment in exploration. The Gulf of Mexico can grow a lot if you invest. Brazil, Guyana, and even some niche areas will absorb some investment. That will take investment dollars in exploration, but in places that are not frontier areas. That's why I said it's a waste of resources to spend exploration dollars in, off Amapá or the Foz do Amazonas region. They have high potential indeed, but it's not very likely they will ever reach it.
Was 40 years ago, not now.
Exactly. If we had started even 20 years ago, I would agree, but there just wasn't money to do all of this. So we have to recognize the reality nowadays is that we are destined to rely primarily on those 3 regions plus the Middle East. And the Middle East with a lot of rearrangement, Russia almost out of the picture, China on its own, and basically not much else. Niche plays are not attractive to the majors. So that is just, a selection of a lot of little plays all over, which, can contribute to the 80 or 100 million barrels a day. But the gross portion will come from just 3 or 4 plays.
Important correction. Thank you so much. Exploration needs to go forward, but in the regions that we just have assessed.
You see, the implications is that there are going to be a lot of winners, maybe not the ones normally we think about, and there will be a lot of losers. So the repositioning is going to be very important. And for that repositioning, we have maybe 5 years for the majors to really do that. And if they don't reposition, and if they have dollars in the losing regions, they have big write-offs. And if they don't bet on the winning regions, they miss out. That's
perfect. Going to the last and tricky question, please, Professor Cleveland Jones. ExxonMobil is starting to explore lithium, and Brazil is very strongly to invest in wind, offshore wind, and things like that. So, how do you see this big oil investing in this renewable terms? Let's see.
I think the big oil has the resources to do that in addition to doing all of the exploratory investment that will be required. It's not a question of not enough money. They are the ones that can and should do this investing. In particular, I agree that lithium is a very likely concentration for them to invest, because oil and gas operations in mature fields in the U.S., for example, present a fantastic opportunity just in the existing wells and produced water to produce the lithium. In Brazil, it's slightly different, but again, it's the same companies that have the infrastructure, the know-how, and so on. So I think that doesn't detract from the necessary investment. We have been under-investing for a long time in exploration. We will have to do some catch-up. But they have the funds, and they will, despite all this talk about leaving fossil fuels. They do have the money to do both, and I think they should, because lithium is important towards the energy mix looking forward.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Excellent, Professor Cleveland Jones. Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure to have you here today, another Tuesday. And we are planning to have weekly meetings. For me, it's a great pleasure.
Okay, great. I look forward to it, and thank you and success.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.